Hey guys, tonight we're slipping behind stone walls, down into torchlit storage vaults, past wooden racks of drying herbs and barrels of pickled mystery meat. You're not here as a visitor, you're one of the residents, tucked inside a medieval castle under siege. Outside, the enemy hammers at your gates. Inside, you and a few hundred others are wondering how long the food will last. Spoiler, you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Post your location and the current time in the comments. I always love seeing where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It begins long before the siege, because once those enemy banners appear on the horizon, you don't get to run to the market and grab a last-minute wheel of cheese. You've already had your chance. Months, maybe, years before the attack, the castle steward began planning. He's a walking spreadsheet in a wool robe, counting beans, tracking bushels of barley, and making grim calculations about how many people will need to eat how many calories for how many weeks. And that's if the weather doesn't ruin the harvest, or the rats don't nibble through half the stores, or the castle lord doesn't suddenly decide to throw a feast with 3 roast swans and a barrel of mead. Your life depends on planning. That means stockpiles. Lots of them. Grain is the cornerstone: barley, rye, wheat if you're lucky, oats too, for the horses, and also for your very uninspiring porridge. These dry goods are stored in sacks and barrels, tucked into the coolest, driest parts of the keep, usually underground in vaulted cellars that smell like mold and secrets. The walls are thick, the air is still, and your food is stacked like gold. And honestly, it is gold, at least right now. You've got legume spears, lentils, fava beans all dried, and kept in clay jars sealed with wax or cloth soaked in tallow. They'll keep forever, if you're lucky and diligent. Every so often, someone goes down there with a lantern to check for rot or insects, sniffing suspiciously at anything that smells off, which is a difficult game in a place where everything already smells faintly awful. Salted meats, more on that later, get stored in wooden barrels. Fish too, often herring or eels. You'd be amazed at how long a dead fish can survive if it's been thoroughly buried in salt. And don't forget cheese. Hard cheese. The kind that could probably survive a minor earthquake. Wheels of it are stacked on shelves like sleepy yellow sentinels, aging into sharp, crumbly sustenance. Some castles even have dried fruit if they're rich. Raisins, dates, and figs from faraway places, brought in on trade caravans long before the siege began. These are rare, almost mythical luxuries. You guard them with your life. Actually, more accurately, someone else guards them with your life, because you're definitely not the one in charge of the dried fig vault. The steward also orders the firewood stacked high and the water barrels filled. The castle well is protected. If you're lucky, it's inside the keep. If not, you've got a real problem. Water gets stored in barrels or casks, sealed tight, and kept far from waste or heat. Medieval water isn't always safe, so you're going to hear more about watered-down ale soon enough. What's wild is that all this preparation happens with no idea when the siege will come, or if. Sometimes decades pass without a serious attack. So why bother? Because when it does happen, it's fast and brutal, and no one wants to be the lord who forgot to stock beans. That guy's castle becomes a tomb. Historians still argue whether castles were ever truly siege-proof. But we know one thing for sure. The ones that survived longer were always the ones that had good logistics. You could have the thickest stone walls and a moat full of crocodiles. Okay, not real crocodiles, but imagine. But if your people are chewing bark by week 2, the fight is already over. And here's the fringe tidbit. In some cases, especially in wealthier castles, lords kept bizarre, exotic foods on hand, preserved in strange way-scanded ginger from the east, pickled walnuts, or even dried rose petals meant for tea. Totally useless in terms of calories, but they made people feel fancy. Hope you enjoy sipping petal tea while your neighbors gnaw their belts. Oh, and there's the castle cat. She's not food yet, but give it time. Right now she's patrolling the cellars for rats. Later, she might be Sunday stew. You can almost hear the doors slam shut now. The last cart rolls inside. The portcullis groans. You're sealed in. It's not just a fortress, no, it's a pantry with very sharp walls. And if you've miscalculated, you won't even need a battering ram to fall. You'll crumble from the inside, one hungry belly at a time. You wake up to the sound of snorting and bleating. That's because you're now sharing your living space with half a barnyard. In a proper siege-ready castle, livestock isn't kept outside the walls, prancing around in picturesque meadows. No, they're right here beside you, inside the keep, grumbling, sweating, and doing very unromantic barnyard things. There are goats rubbing their heads on the stone walls, pigs grunting under hay piles, chickens wandering freely across the flagstones, leaving surprises in your breakfast bowl if you're not careful. Welcome to medieval siege, life smelly, loud, and weirdly warm. But these animals aren't pets. They're dinner, or more accurately, they're insurance. They walk, they breathe, and most importantly, they don't spoil. Yet, the logic is simple. If you slaughter everything at the start of the siege, you'll have a big pile of meat and a bigger problem. Meat goes bad fast, even with salting. So instead, you keep the animals alive for as long as you can, like slow-release food capsules. Milk the goats daily, gather eggs from the hens, and feed the pigs your table scraps. It's like managing a micro-farm in the middle of a war zone. Cozy, right? Of course, the downside is that animals take up space, consume valuable grain, and make the castle feel less like a sanctuary and more like a crowded petting zoo with a death sentence. There's a hierarchy here too. Chickens and goats usually get eaten last because they provide ongoing food, eggs and milk. Pigs, on the other hand, are often among the first to go. They're loud, destructive, and don't give you anything except themselves. Plus, in tight quarters, pigs start chewing on things they shouldn't, like people. That's not just a grim joke, there are actual accounts of pigs turning feral during long sieges. So yeah, maybe don't get too emotionally attached to Sir Snortsworth in the corner. Cows, if you're rich enough to keep any, are a prized resource. Milk, butter, possibly cheese, and if things get truly desperate, a whole lot of beef. But they take up enormous space and eat a staggering amount, so only the more luxurious castles keep full-grown cattle inside during a siege. Most settlements rely on goats, smaller, hardier, and less inclined to moo mournfully through the night and ruin everyone's sleep. And then there are the horses. War horses, especially massive, armoured beasts with tempers to match their muscle. You don't want to eat them if you can help it. They're invaluable for defence, for morale, and for escape plans if the walls fall. Killing a horse for food is like eating your getaway car. That said, there are records of desperate garrisons doing just that. Roast horse flank isn't ideal, but compared to starvation, it starts looking pretty appealing. Now, historians still argue whether castles routinely kept full herds indoors or rotated animals through temporary shelters depending on the season and threat level. There's some evidence that in peacetime, animals were kept in outer yards or nearby pastures, and only moved inside when danger loomed. But others argue that truly paranoid castles kept stables fortified year-round, just in case. Either way, by the time a siege begins, there's no more back and forth. The gates are shut. You and your animals are in it together. One of the weirder survival tactics? Dung. Not eating it. Obvious though, don't get too comfortable. We'll get to worse things later. No, dung has a secondary use. In the absence of wood or coal, dried animal droppings become emergency fuel. It smells atrocious, yes, but if you want your porridge warm, you'll light whatever you can. Nothing gets wasted during a siege. Not even the gross stuff. The presence of animals changes everything. It affects how you store food, keep it out of reach, how you sleep, don't roll into a goat, and how you clean. Or rather, how you fail to clean. The hygiene situation goes from questionable to catastrophic very fast. Imagine the stench of hundreds of people in close quarters, no plumbing, and a growing pile of animal droppings. Even in stone castles with proper waste chutes and garderobes, the volume during a siege is overwhelming. Disease becomes a real threat, maybe even more dangerous than the enemy outside. But here's a quirky tidbit for you. In some castles, pigs were used as psychological weapons. No, really. If the enemy tried to burn or collapse your tunnel system, you could light fires using pig fathily flammably and smoke them out. There's even a bizarre account from Rochester Castle in 1215 where defenders allegedly used the burning fat of 40 pigs to collapse a mine dug by besieging forces. That's medieval warfare for you, equal parts brilliant and disturbing. Of course, not everyone inside the castle gets equal access to the fresh stuff. The lord and his inner circle eat first and best. The soldiers get the next. Pick-strong defenders are a priority. Everyone else, servants, workers, peasants, get whatever's left. If the goat's only giving 1 pint of milk, guess who's not getting a sip? You learn to live on boiled oats and dried peas, and keep your envy in check while the Lord slurps down his buttered eggs. And you can't overuse your livestock either. You have to balance your consumption against time. If the siege lasts a week, fine. If it drags into months, and you've already eaten the chickens, the goats, and your last pig, well, things get ugly. Like, boil your shoe ugly. The steward keeps strict records. Who ate what, when, and how much remains. Food gets rationed in portions so small you start dreaming about turnips. A pig slaughtered too early could mean doom later. A goat milked too harshly might stop producing. Every resource is monitored, like it's a royal treasure, because during a siege, it is. You look at the chicken looks at you. It knows. You know. It's a temporary arrangement. There's a little patch of dirt near the inner wall. It's not impressive, more like a trampled courtyard with stubborn weeds and a few struggling shoots. But if you've got sunshine, soil, and a few seeds, you've got a garden. And in the middle of a siege, that scraggly, hard-won patch of green becomes your secret weapon. You crouch down beside the wall, gently pruning a tuft of parsley like it's a crown jewel. And it might as well be. When your diet's gone grey and beige beans, salt meat, oat, porridge, anything fresh is precious. This isn't farming. This is hope, growing in miniature. Castles weren't just stone shells full of shouting knights and echoing halls. The smartest ones included space for growing things. These were not massive fields of wheat. Of course, you're not harvesting haystacks behind the battlements, but they were cunningly tucked in vegetable beds, herb corners, and sometimes even planters on balconies or rooftops. It's medieval container gardening at its most desperate. Onions, leeks, radishes, kale, cabbagesol, fast-growing, hardy crops that can handle shallow soil and rough conditions. No one's planting delicate fruit trees. You're going for survival greens, things you can harvest in a few weeks, again and again, without needing much water or care. There's evidence from places like Chateau Gaillard and Windsor Castle that siege-era courtyards were used to cultivate emergency produce. Some castles even had dedicated kitchen gardens inside their inner walls, especially those with high defensive priorities and limited access to outside farmland. Historians still argue whether these gardens were productive enough to feed large populations, or whether they were more supplementary, helping prevent scurvy, for example, rather than filling bellies. Either way, they mattered. When you've eaten nothing but salted pork for 20 days, a fistful of raw green onion tastes like a miracle. You work these gardens daily. You pull weeds, shoe chickens, sprinkle what little water you can spare, and pray the sun behaves. The soil isn't great, it's been walked over for decades, but you mix in old compost, animal droppings, or whatever organic waste you can find. It's not glamorous. You're kneeling in muck while arrows whistle overhead, but every sprig of thyme you coax from the dirt feels like an act of rebellion against the starvation waiting outside your gates. And herbs, don't underestimate them, not just for flavour, which is sorely needed, but for their medicinal uses. Mint for nausea, sage for inflammation, yarrow for wounds. These herbs grow fast, take up little room, and store well when dried. That's your mini pharmacy right there in the soil, and when the healer comes asking, you're suddenly the most important gardener in the keep. One quirky trick used in some castles: hanging planters. You take broken buckets or bits of old roof tile, fill them with dirt, and hang them along inner walls or windowsills to make use of every sliver of light. It's a vertical garden in a world with no room to spare. Imagine looking up from the castle courtyard and seeing carrots sprouting out of the windows like botanical eyebrows. It's ridiculous. It's also genius. Of course, the animals don't care. Goats will nibble anything green. Chickens will dig up your leeks the moment you look away. You build tiny fences. You yell. You shoo with your boots. It's an endless battle. But even with their interference, your patch of dirt keeps giving. In peacetime, no one would bother noticing a sprig of basil. Now it's practically sacred. The cook loves you, or at least, the cook pretends to tolerate you. A single bunch of chives can transform an otherwise joyless stew into something people line up for. A few crushed leaves of rosemary can hide the sour tang of nearly rotten meat. When the barrels of preserved food start losing their charm, your herbs bring relief. Tiny, fragrant, leafy relief. The kitchen staff start bribing you. A little extra porridge if you give up your dill. A boiled egg if you hand over the good lettuce. You're no longer just a dirt scraper. You're a power player in the castle's underground spice market. Because let's face it, people will do ridiculous things for even a hint of fresh taste when they've been chewing old biscuit for weeks. There's also the morale factor. It's hard to overstate how valuable it is to see something grow while everything else is falling apart. Outside, the enemy digs trenches. Inside, your turnip sprouts stretch toward the light. It makes people feel like things aren't entirely doomed. Even if the walls fall, your little patch of green says, "We're still here." Now, some fringe theories suggest certain castles experimented with growing mushrooms in underground chambers during long sieges. The damp, dark cellars were perfect for it. If true, this would have been an absolute game-changer fresh protein that required no sunlight and minimal care. But we don't have solid proof for that. Still, it's the kind of creative desperation that fits siege life perfectly. You get better at this. You learn how to replant cuttings, how to stretch your yield, how to dry leaves for future use. Every little technique matters. Nothing is wasted, not seeds, not scraps, not even the dirt itself, which you rotate and aerate with all the reverence of a priest tending holy relics. Some nights you sit in your garden with a cup of weak ale and just breathe. It's quiet, peaceful even, and in that moment, with your hands in the soil and the scent of thyme in the air, you almost forget that 100 yards away, someone is firing a flaming arrow at your roof. Almost. The day finally comes when you bite into something that crunches not because it's fresh, but because it's been preserved so aggressively it could break a tooth. You're eating salt meat. Again. Your jaw aches before you finish chewing, but it's food. And more importantly, it's still edible, which means the preservation plan is working. Every castle under siege depends on it. Without preservation, your supplies would have rotted within the first week, and you'd be gnawing bark by now. Instead, you're living off food that's been deliberately tortured into longevity. And oh, do you taste every bit of that suffering? Meat doesn't last long in its natural state. Even in the coldest parts of the year, you've got a few days, maybe a week, before it starts to go bad. That's why the first thing any well-run castle does before a siege is salt everything. Salt pork, salt beef, even salt fish, though fish has its own techniques. You rub the meat with so much salt it looks like it snowed indoors. Then you pack it tightly into barrels, often with layers of lard or brine. It becomes pale, dense, and nearly unrecognizable, but it stays good for months. Smoking is another key method. Meat gets hung above special hearths or in small, controlled smokehouses, usually in a side chamber of the kitchen or bakery ware. Slow, constant fire infuses it with preservative magic. That smoky tang lingers long after the meat is gone. Everything starts to taste like campfire and desperation. You've had smoked pork, smoked fish, smoked goose, even smoked cheese. If it can be smoked, it will be. Then there's pickling. Vegetables that would have spoiled in days now bob, in vinegary jars behind the kitchen. Cucumbers, onions, cabbage, even apples. Your stomach winces at the acidity, but your body's grateful. In the absence of fresh greens, a pickled turnip is practically a blessing. Vinegar itself is precious. It preserves, it cleans, it even wards off plague, according to some. You guard it like gold. Cheese preservation is its own dark art. You start with curds, press them, salt them, and let them harden into wheels tougher than your boots. They age in cool cellars where the air smells like sweaty socks and old caves. When cut open, some are crumbly and sharp. Others, especially the richer ones, develop rinds so thick you need a blade to break through. But once inside, creamy salvation. Historians still argue whether aging cheese was a deliberate siege strategy or just a side benefit of pre-modern kitchens. Either way, it worked. Cheese lasted. Fish preservation deserves a special mention. Inland castles relied heavily on salted herring or dried cod, often brought in during peacetime and stored away like precious scrolls. If your castle's near a river, lucky you might get fresh trout or eels before the siege begins. After that, it's all about the barrels. Some castles even had dedicated fish towers, built partly for defense and partly for storing fish at cool, stable temperatures. It sounds absurd, but these towers could mean the difference between survival and collapse. Of course, not all preserved food is pleasant. Some is outright weird. You've eaten black pudding made from dried pig's blood and barley. You've chewed strips of dried eel that had the texture of old rope. One time, You were given something that might have been a salted goose gizzard, and you didn't ask questions. Fringe tidbit. Some medieval households preserved eggs by slathering them in a mix of lime and ash, or even burying them in clay. It worked. Sort of. You'd have to really hate yourself to eat one, but in week 6 of a siege, shame is a luxury you no longer afford. You even preserve bread, in a way. Hard tack, those joyless bricks of baked flour and water can last for years if kept dry. They're so tough you have to soak them in broth or ale just to soften them enough to chew. But they keep, and that's all that matters. There's an art to managing these stores. You can't just dive into the good stuff immediately. The steward enforces a grim rotation schedule. Eat the meat that'll spoil first. Save the hard cheese and dry fish for the end. Open only one pickle barrel at a time. Don't touch the last cask of vinegar unless things are truly dire. If someone breaks the rules, that's a punishable offense. Food discipline during a siege is as important as military discipline, maybe more so. Still, no matter how clever the methods, preserved food comes with a cost. Your digestion suffers. Salted meat dehydrates you. Smoked foods upset your stomach. Pickles burn on the way down. You get mouth sores. Your skin cracks. You start craving something any fresh. That's when the gardens become your sanctuary again. A sprig of parsley, a few wild chives, and suddenly your sour stew feels slightly less like punishment. There's also the psychological toll. Meals become mechanical. You eat to survive, not to enjoy. You stop talking during dinner. You just chew and chew and chew. It all starts to taste the same. That's why little things matter: spices, herbs, even a spoonful of honey saved for emergencies. There's a jar hidden in the pantry marked with a ribbon. No one touches it yet. It's for the night morale collapses completely. That one spoonful might be enough to keep someone from losing hope. And then there's the ale. Weak, thin, but safer than the water. Even children drink it. Brewing is a form of preservation too. The alcohol kills bacteria, and you can store barrels for months if sealed properly. It's the daily drink now, not because people love it, but because the well water might be poisoned. You'd rather be tipsy than dead. Every castle has its own tricks. Some coat meat in fat and store it in cold clay jars. Some bake bread twice to dry it into long-lasting rusks. One account even describes soup made with powdered dried greens, something like medieval instant broth. It's gritty and greenish and tastes like lawn clippings. But when you're desperate, you don't complain. By this point, you understand the full meaning of preservation. It's not just a kitchen term. It's the act of staying alive, bite by bite, while the enemy waits for you to run out of reasons to hold on. But your cellars are still half full. The salt barrels are stacked high, and until they're empty, so is your surrender. By now, you've figured out that staying alive during a siege means more than just hoarding grain and chewing jerky until your jaw locks up. You need fluids, and lots of them. The problem? Water in a medieval castle is about as reliable as a wooden sword. If you're lucky, you've got a deep, covered well within the castle walls. If you're not, your only sources are barrels filled ahead of time, rain collection systems, or whatever you manage to drag in before the gates slammed shut. And when that runs low, you face a choice. Trust questionable water, or drink beer. That's right, booze is safer than water. Not in the frat party sense, but in the literal, survivalist, I don't want to die of dysentery sense. Medieval water sources were often contaminated. Wells near latrines, rivers downstream from settlements, storage barrels that grew slime in the dark. None of it was trustworthy. Boiling could help, but you can't boil every drop, not with limited fuel. So instead, you do what people have been doing for centuries. You brew. You're not guzzling goblets of strong ale here. Siege beer is usually what they called small beer, a low-alcohol brew made with barley, water, and maybe a handful of herbs. It's lightly fermented, just enough to kill bacteria, but not enough to get you dancing on the ramparts. Even kids drink it. In fact, children often get their daily hydration from ale before they ever taste clean water. It's cloudy, slightly sour, and just strong enough to keep your gut from revolting. Every castle has its brewhouse, often located near the kitchen or bakehouse to share heat. Big copper kettles, wooden fermentation vats, and barrels stacked like firewood. When the siege begins, brewing doesn't stop, it ramps up. You've got to stretch your grain stores between bread and beer, which leads to some grim compromises. watery gruel, or weak ale. Both use the same barley. Choose wisely. Sometimes they reused mash from strong brews to make a weaker second batch. A clever trick to extend the supply. That second run was what the common folk got. The Lord, of course, drank the first batch stronger, cleaner, and much tastier. You, meanwhile, sip something closer to barley-flavoured rainwater. Still, it's wet, and it won't kill you. But it's not just beer. If your castle is especially well stocked or just unusually fond of the finer things, you might also have mead or wine in storage. Mead, made from fermented honey, is a luxury, and it keeps well if sealed properly. Wine, particularly if imported or from a well-kept vineyard, also lasts for months or even years. The richer the castle, the deeper its cellar, and the more dusty bottles of joy are hidden in stone nooks behind false walls. These drinks serve more than just hydration. They're medicine. Weak wine gets mixed with herbs for stomach aches. Warm ale helps calm nerves. Mead mixed with spices might be your only remedy for a cold. Some even believe different types of drink affected your humus wine for melancholy, beer for cheer, mead for courage. Whether any of that was true, it certainly gave people a reason to keep drinking. Historians still argue whether alcohol was consumed more out of necessity or habit. Did people drink because they had to, or because they liked it? Likely both. But during a siege, it's clearly strategic. When the enemy is trying to outweight your will to fight, morale becomes a weapon, and nothing lifts spirits like a hot cup of mulled wine on a cold, miserable night behind the battlements. But of course, alcohol only goes so far. You still need water. The good castles had ingenious systems. Stone cisterns carved into inner courtyards to collect rain. Lead pipes, lead. Try not to think about it channeling runoff into barrels. Some castles even had underground springs diverted into secret basins beneath the keep. These were closely guarded secrets, known only to the Lord and a few trusted workers. Fringe tidbit for you. In some castles, they disguised access to the well or spring to prevent sabotage. One tale tells of a castle where the main water supply was hidden beneath a statue in the chapel. Another describes an entire false wall that masked a tunnel leading to a stream. Protecting water wasn't just smart, it was survival insurance. Of course, the enemy knew this. Poisoning wells was a classic tactic. So, you had water testers, usually unlucky servants, whose job was to sample small amounts before anyone else drank. If they keeled over, you knew something was wrong. If they didn't, well, bottoms up. You ration water as carefully as food. Drinking, cooking, washing, each use is counted. You learn to reuse water wherever possible. Bathing becomes rare. Not that it was frequent to begin with. Dishes get cleaned with sand or scraped with cloth. Full body washing? Maybe once a month. And that's a luxury. You use rainwater for your herbs, your face, and your occasional desperate attempt at feeling human again. And yet, despite all this planning, water always runs low. By week 3, your lips are dry, your tongue feels like it's wrapped in wool, and you eye the condensation on cellar walls with quiet jealousy. You ration ale more strictly. You start chewing herbs to create saliva. Some people even try to collect dew, dragging cloth over stone walls in the morning and squeezing out drops. It helps. Barely. But there's one thing worse than dehydration. Watching your fellow defenders start to collapse. Fatigue sets in. Tempers flare. People bicker over who got a bigger ladle of soup. Drunkenness, even on weak ale, leads to fights. The steward begins cutting back portions, worried that the beer won't last another week. Whispers start about diluting the remaining stores with shudder-untested water. That's when you know you're near the breaking point. And yet, as the fire crackles and your belly gurgles, you raise your cup to your lips. The beer is thin, a little sour, and far from satisfying. But it's safe. And tonight, that's enough. You drink slowly. Let the warmth settle your nerves, and listen to the muffled sounds of a distant catapult thudding outside the wall. Another day down. Another drink earned. You wake up and reach for your daily ration, and what greets you is something between a rock and a doorstop. Siege bread. You crack a corner off, soak it in weak ale, and gnaw slowly, wondering for the 100th time what exactly is in it. The truth? Anything that could be ground down and baked without instantly poisoning you. Bread, the staple of life, has now become a grim exercise in culinary desperation. Welcome to the world of biscuit hell. In the early days of the siege, bread is still familiar course. Brown, heavy, but recognizably made from barley, rye, or spelt. Wheat is rare and precious, used only for the Lord's table. You get the leftovers, bran-rich flour that's tough on the stomach but keeps you going. But as the siege drags on, the flour starts to dwindle, and the baker has to get creative. You've eaten bread, made from ground peas, mashed beans, acorn flour, and even dried moss mixed with oats. Some of it barely qualifies as food. All of it fills your belly like cement. Hardtack is the real star of this misery parade. Known in various forms throughout the centuries, it's essentially a thick cracker baked until every last drop of moisture is gone. When stored properly, it can last for years, possibly longer than you. The downside? It's about as soft as a paving stone. You have to soak it in soup or ale, just to make it chewable. If you're really unlucky, you bite down and chip a tooth on a fossilized weevil. Yes, weevil-stony beetles that infest flour stores. They're almost impossible to avoid when your grain's been sitting in a sack for 6 months. Most people learn to ignore them. Extra protein, you tell yourself. Crunchy, mildly horrifying protein. But bread isn't just bread anymore. It's rationed, guarded, measured by the slice. The steward stands behind the baker with a slate and a stick, counting loaves and tallying portions. Soldiers get bigger pieces. Nobles get the softest crusts. You take what you're given, and thank whatever saint still listens to the starving. There's no second helping. Not now, maybe not ever. You also start seeing trench as the original edible plate. Thick slabs of stale bread used to serve meat and stews. In peacetime, they'd be tossed to dogs or given to the poor afterward. In siege time, they're dinner. You scrape every last drop from your wooden bowl and then eat the bowl itself, chewy with broth and fingers of charred garlic. It's not elegant, but it works. Historians still debate whether trenchers were used widely during sieges or if they were more ceremonial. But there's no question about one thing. You don't waste food, even if that food is technically your tableware. Eventually, the flour stretches so thin that substitutes sneak in. You mix in dried nettle leaves, powdered roots, ground chestnuts, anything to bulk it up. In France, there's record of bread being made with ground grape seeds and straw. In parts of England, people boiled thistles, dried them, and crushed them into flour. It gives the bread a greenish tint and a sharp, earthy taste that lingers unpleasantly for hours. One quirky but fascinating method. Some castles kept old loaves in storage as yeast starters. These sour chunks could be crumbled into new dough to help it rise if you had any leavening agents left. But by now, most of the bread is unleavened, flat and dense. It stacks like bricks, breaks like porcelain, and chews like old leather. But you eat it anyway, because you're not eating for pleasure. You're eating to survive. And the baker, the poor baker, everyone hates him by week 4. He's the gatekeeper of stomachs, the guy who decides how big your piece is, and whether it gets the better crust or the bitter bottom. He's got flour in his hair, ash on his hands, and more enemies than the captain of the guard. But without him, you'd all be gnawing on table legs. You don't thank him, of course, but you also don't punch him, because who else is going to know how to make bread from crushed beans and powdered shame? Sometimes, if the oven heat is too precious, they bake flatbreads on hot stones. It's faster, requires less fuel, and gives you something that resembles a warm tortilla. Kind of. Other times, they use a communal oven built into the wall of the courtyard, firing it once in the morning and baking as much as they can before the heat fades. If you're late picking up your ration, you're out of luck. Bread waits for no one. Historians still argue whether castles had enough stored flour to maintain regular bread making for long sieges, or whether they switched to porridge and pottage once supplies dwindled. Either way, the bread gets worse. You start to dream of warm, soft loaves with butter melting on top. You start to resent anyone who's ever complained about crusts being too hard. You'd kill for crusts right now. And speaking of porridge, yes, it's a backup. Ground oats, barley, or peas boiled into a thick, miserable sludge. It's hot, it fills you up, and it takes less flour than bread. But it turns to paste within minutes and sticks to your ribs in the worst way. If you're lucky, they stir in a pinch of salt or a chopped herb from the garden. If you're not, it's grey goo, and you force it down while pretending it doesn't taste like scorched despair. But bread real, actual bread remains the dream. It becomes a symbol of life before the siege, of comfort and normalcy. The castle's last sack of flour is hidden away in a locked chest. It's not just for emergencies. It is the emergency. When morale is at its lowest, when people whisper about surrender, that's when the Lord allows the final loaf to be baked. One last round, one final crumb of hope, shared among defenders like communion. You take a bite and close your eyes. It's tough, dry, and a little bitter, but you chew slowly, savoring the memory of what bread used to be and what it still means. Down in the lowest level of the keep, beneath stone vaults that smell like earth and old smoke, a rhythmic thump, thump, thump echoes through the walls. That's you, turning grain into survival. You're grinding. Not with a watermill or a windmill, those are out of reach now, either destroyed or beyond the walls. No, this is siege grinding, done by hand in secret, on small rotary querns the size of dinner plates. You sit cross-legged on the floor, cloth wrapped around the base to muffle the sound, your arms aching as you twist the upper stone in slow, grinding circles. This is the sound of resistance. The enemy outside doesn't hear you, and that's the point. Large mills are useless during a siege. They're typically placed outside the castle for access to wind or flowing water, and that makes them vulnerable. So, when the gates close and the siege begins, castles turn inward, pulling out hand querns from storerooms and attics. These primitive grinders are simple-to circular stones, grain poured through a hole in the top, flour pushed out from the sides, but they work, slowly, painfully. One person might spend hours just to grind enough flour for a single loaf, and now, that person is you. You've been at it since dawn, hands powdered in flour, sleeves crusted with grain dust. The room is warm, not from a fire but from sheer human effort. 2 other grinders work beside you, heads down, arms trembling. You switch sides every few minutes to keep the muscle burn from becoming unbearable. It still becomes unbearable. You grunt and rotate, over and over. The stones grind, the flour drifts into bowls, and your mind wanders to the days when bread simply arrived on a table without a personal arm workout attached. To hide the sound, heavy fabrics are hung over the walls. A cloth is draped over the top of the quern. Sometimes you sing softly old work chants that match the rhythm of the grind. It helps distract from the cramps forming in your shoulders. This is supposed to be a secret operation. No one wants the enemy to hear this, because if they know you're still grinding grain, it tells them you're not starving yet. And if they think you are starving, they might press harder, hoping to break you before the food gives out. Historians still argue whether this kind of underground grinding was common or rare, but evidence suggests it definitely happened, especially in long sieges where managing morale and secrecy was critical. There are accounts of grinding chambers set deep within keeps, reinforced with extra stone, lined with old firs to deaden the sound. Some castles even had rotating grinding crews, with shifts scheduled to avoid exhausting the same workers each day. If you were lucky, you got to rest after a 2-hour stint. You're not lucky today. There's also the constant problem of fuel. The more flour you grind, the more baking you want to do. But ovens need firewood or charcoal, and that's in short supply. So you get creative. Flatbreads cooked on heated stones, or grain boiled into thick porridge instead of baked. Sometimes the flour doesn't even get cooked. It's mixed with a little water and chewed like paste. It's awful, but it keeps you alive. Then there's sifting. Not all flour is equal. After grinding, you sift it through coarse cloth to remove husks and larger debris. The finer the cloth, the finer the flour. But cloth itself is precious now, so sometimes you skip sifting and just chew the gritty result. Bread made with unsifted flour is dense, dark, and full of surprises. Bits of gravel, tiny twigs, the occasional beetle. You pick them out if you can. If you can't, well, extra minerals. One of the fringe tricks used in some sieges was mixing flour with things that weren't flour at all. Ground up roots, dried fern spores, even powdered bark. It stretches the dough and fools the stomach. The texture is strange, and the taste is worse, but your body doesn't care. It's fuel. Every bite is borrowed time. You guard the grain itself like treasure. It's stored in sacks tied shut with rope, labelled with chalk or carved symbols. Each sack is counted daily. If someone steals even a handful, it's treated like treason. Guards are posted at the storage chambers. Only the steward and the grinding crew have keys. And if someone's caught cheating grabbing extra grain for themselves, they're not punished with a slap on the wrist. They're locked in the coldest room, made to fast for a day, sometimes worse. The whole community knows. steal food, and you're stealing from everyone. Despite the harshness, grinding becomes strangely meditative. The repetition, the rhythm, the scent of flour and sweat, it puts you in a trance. You imagine you're anywhere else. A quiet village, a sunlit kitchen. You picture warm loaves cooling on windowsills, not crusty brown slabs handed out by the ounce. You dream in circles round loaves, round stones, round meals that never end. By nightfall, you've ground enough for a batch of porridge and a few small loaves. Your arms hang limp, your legs have gone numb, and your tunic is stiff with flour dust, but the bowls are full. The kitchen crew comes in, wordless, and collects the flour like it's holy. You wipe your face on your sleeve, stretch your fingers, and stand, slowly. You'll be back here tomorrow, and the day after that, until either the grain runs out or the siege ends. And just before you leave, you hear the soft clink of another grinder starting up. The next shift. They nod to you as they settle in, stretch their backs, and start the slow, steady rotation. The thump, thump, thump resumes. It's quiet, but it's defiant. Outside, the enemy waits for you to starve. Down here, under stone and shadow, you grind back. You can feel the hunger pressing in now. It's not the kind that growls and fades. This one sticks to your bones, buzzing behind your eyes, making your hands tremble when you try to lift a spoon. The cellars are quieter these days. The animals are mostly gone, the bread's down to nubs, and even the pickled radishes seem like feasts. That's why, tonight, you're not sleeping. You're slipping out. It's not sanctioned, not approved, and definitely not safe, but it might keep you alive. Because sometimes, in a siege, the difference between starvation and survival is a foraging raid. It begins with whispers someone knows a place, an old cottage just beyond the outer wall, or maybe an abandoned root cellar left half buried before the siege began. Maybe the enemy lines haven't tightened completely yet. Maybe they're drunk. Maybe the moon's low. So you gather with two others in the dark, wrap your boots in cloth to muffle your steps, and slide out through a Sally Porter hidden door in the wall, no bigger than a wardrobe. Not every castle had one, but the best ones did, tucked away behind ivy or stone, used for water runs, scouting, or this, desperate food theft. The night air hits you like a slap. It smells like campfire and wet grass, tinged with the metallic tang of fear. You keep low. You move fast. You listen for enemy scouts and the occasional bark of a dog. Every sound feels like it's aimed at you. One wrong step, one snapped twig, and you'll end up dangling from a rope or worse, impaled on a pike as a warning to your friends. But still, you go, because your stomach doesn't understand strategy. It just knows it's empty. Your target tonight is a root cellar half collapsed, barely standing, just outside the village ruins that once fed your castle. You reach it breathless, crawl through the narrow gap, and light a stub of tallow candle. Inside, the air is thick and earthy. You scrape your fingers across the floor. They're turnips. Wrinkled, spotted, but edible, behind a crumbling wall. A sack. You pull it open. Beans, maybe dried peas. You grin in the dark, teeth gleaming like a wolf's. You've hit gold. Some raids are bigger. A full sortie, slipping out to ambush a supply train or set fire to an enemy storehouse. Dangerous work, led by knights or seasoned soldiers. But the quiet raids, the scavenging missions, those are more common, and riskier in a different way. You're not looking for glory. You're looking for cabbages, and that makes it all the more desperate. Historians still argue how common these food raids were during sieges. Some claim they were regular tactics, organized, systematic, even approved by commanders. Others say they were rare and deeply frowned upon, done only by the most desperate or defiant. What we do know, they happened. Too many siege accounts speak of sudden fire beyond the walls, or strange noises at night, or enemy sentries waking to find their stores picked clean and no sign of who took them. And then there's the flip side raids from the enemy. If you leave your own fields or outer buildings intact, you risk handing food to your besiegers. That's why, at the start of any serious siege, the castle's defenders often burn their own crops, slaughter their own livestock, and collapse anything usable outside the walls. Scorched earth. It hurts, but it denies your enemy what they need most: sustenance. If you didn't do it before they arrived, well, you're paying for that mistake now. Back inside, you're greeted like a hero, quietly. No cheers, No fanfare, just a grateful nod from the steward and an immediate confiscation of what you brought. It gets logged, counted, weighed, and distributed. You keep nothing for yourself, except the knowledge that someone might sleep with a less hollow stomach because of what you did. But not every raid ends well. You've seen friends return bloodied, limping, carrying nothing but bruises and bad news. You've seen someone not return at all. The next morning, a head on a spike just beyond the range of your archers, a message, loud and silent all at once. Your castle mourns quietly. You say nothing. You go again anyway. Sometimes, the risk is worth it. You remember one raid that brought back a goat starving, ragged but alive. It fed 30 people for 3 days. Or the night someone came back with a barrel of apples, half rotten but still good enough to boil into mash. For one glorious afternoon, the kitchen smelled like cider instead of sweat and ash. It was enough to make people smile. Briefly. There are even stranger stories. One night, someone snuck into the enemy camp and stole a bag of flour right out of their supply wagon. They left a note behind that read, "Thanks, yours was fresher." The whole castle buzzed with it for days. It was reckless, stupid, hilarious, but it gave people something precious, morale. And sometimes, that's more important than food. Fringe tidbit here, there's one account from a siege in Spain where defenders trained dogs to carry small sacks of food between the castle and sympathizers in nearby woods. The dogs would slink through enemy lines, low to the ground, tails down, looking like strays. The soldiers ignored them, until one night they caught one and discovered it had 10 sausages tied around its belly. The secret was out. No more dog deliveries after that. You sit in the dark now, back against the cool stone wall, chewing a slice of boiled turnip you helped bring back. It's mealy and bland, but warm. You close your eyes and let the taste carry you for a moment. Your arms hurt. Your feet are blistered. Your heart still races from the fear. But you're here. You ate. And maybe tomorrow, you'll go again. The steward walks by and drops a small pouch in your lap. Inside 3 dried peas and a sprig of garlic chive. Your share. He doesn't smile. He doesn't speak. But the pouch says what words can't. You made a difference. It starts with a missing cat. No one talks about it. Not really. She used to patrol the cellars, a scruffy grey thing with one ear and a talent for catching rats. Then one day, she's gone. Just gone. You overhear someone mention stew that night, and you don't ask questions. You just stop looking for the cat, because you're far enough into the siege now that the hunger is changing people. The polite rules, the unspoken lines, they're fading. Welcome to the part of the siege where food isn't food anymore. It's anything that can be swallowed. You don't get to this point overnight. First, the luxuries disappear. Honey, fruit, anything sweet. Then the bread shrinks, the meat vanishes, the porridge gets thinner. Eventually, even the scraps go. That's when people start looking around and seeing possibilities in places they never would have before. The leather of an old boot, soften it with boiling water, slice it thin, add a few herbs, and you've got yourself a soup. Is it appetizing? Not even remotely. But it gives your stomach something to do. Candle ends, made from animal fat. You scrape them into a pot, mix them with broth, and force it down. You try not to think about what it's doing to your insides. And yes, they've started eating rats. At first it's only the bold, the desperate. But soon, it's sanctioned. Traps are set with crumbs of hardtack. Every rat caught is handed to the steward. Weighed, cleaned, boiled, and divided. There's a chart now. You saw it yourself, ration codes for rodent meat. It tastes like greasy chicken. Sort of. Not that you're picky anymore. You'd eat a belt buckle if it came with sauce. It's not just the rats. Pigeons too. If your castle has tower sand, it does, then you had pigeons. Now, they're almost all gone. Roasted, stewed, plucked with shaking hands and cooked over guttering fires. Their feathers were used to stuff pillows once. Now, they curl and blacken in cooking pots. You saw someone bite into a pigeon leg and cry. Not because it was bad, because it was warm. And still, it gets worse. Some days there's talk of graver things. You hear someone mention the word soap, made from animal fat and lye. It's toxic, but maybe not immediately. One soldier boils a bar and drinks the water off the top. He spends 2 days vomiting and doesn't do it again. Others chew old scraps of linen soaked in broth. You see someone gnawing the heel of a shoe, sucking salt from the leather. You walk past a broom closet, and catch a whiff of stew so sour your stomach flips and you still feel jealous. Historians still argue whether cannibalism occurred during medieval sieges. There are recorded accusations, rumours, grim tales passed down through generations. But confirmation? That's harder. Most chronicles are silent on the worst truths. But now, sitting behind these cold stone walls, you understand how it might happen. When hunger hollows you out, even nightmares begin to look like options. One fringe account, buried in an obscure siege journal, tells of a castle where the bones of executed criminals were boiled for broth. Not eaten, just boiled, in hopes of drawing out some kind of sustenance. A superstition? Maybe. Or maybe just desperation wearing a mask of logic. You start dreaming about food, not just eating but preparing. You imagine slicing onions, roasting meat, kneading warm dough. You remember the way butter melts on fresh bread. You can practically taste it. You wake up chewing your blanket. That's normal now. Everyone does it. The cook once laughed about it. Then he stopped laughing when the blankets started disappearing. The animals are long gone. The goats were first too noisy, too hungry. The chickens vanished quickly. The pigs lasted a bit longer, but their time came too. The only creature left is the Lord's hunting dog, a proud mastiff that sits chained by the hearth. No one talks about him either. Not yet, but people glance in his direction more often now. You catch yourself doing it, and you feel a jolt of shame. He looks back at you with tired eyes. He knows. Even bones aren't spared. Every scrap gets boiled, pounded, turned into thin broth or bone meal. You've licked marrow from old rib cages. You've seen people chew the ends of wooden spoons, just for the texture. Hunger becomes a game of pretending. Pretend you're full. Pretend this watery gruel is stew. Pretend you're strong enough to walk another flight of stairs. But the worst part isn't the chewing. It's the guilt. Because even now, some people still eat better than others. The Lord has his private pantry. The knights get first pick. The steward always seems to have a bit of meat in his teeth. You know it's unfair, but what are you going to do? Riot? You barely have the strength to lift a bucket. So you chew your bark and bean paste, stare at your cracked bowl, and dream of vengeance. Later, when you can stand without trembling. And yet, through all this, people still cook. They still try. The kitchen staff hasn't given up. They chop, they boil, they stir whatever they're handed. Yesterday, someone made a pie crust from crushed beans and candle fat, stuffed it with mashed turnips and dried herbs. It was hideous. It was also the best thing you've tasted in a week. You nearly wept. Tonight's dinner is mystery stew. You don't ask what's in it. It's hot, it's thick, and it coats your throat in a way that makes you feel almost human. You close your eyes and take slow, careful bites. There's something green in it, parsley maybe, or moss. You don't care. You chew. You swallow. You breathe. You're not full. You're never full anymore. But for now, you're not empty either. And in a siege, that's the closest thing to victory you'll get. The chapel is fuller than usual, not with loud voices or hymns, but with stillness. Silent figures line the stone benches, hollow-eyed and slumped, hands folded not just in prayer but in quiet pleading. The smell of incense mixes with old wood smoke, and the faint sour tang of unwashed bodies. You're among them, kneeling because your knees can't take standing anymore, whispering prayers because you don't trust your voice to stay steady. It's not just about faith, it's about rationing hope. And tonight, even hope is running short. In times like this, people turn to ritual, not just for guidance, but for structure. Fasting, for instance. It used to be spirituala discipline, a way to humble the body and lift the soul. Now, it's practical. Holy days become fast days. The rules of the church say no meat on Fridays? Perfect. That's one less meal to plan, one less expectation to disappoint. Every fast observed becomes another chance to stretch the larder just a little further. The steward and chaplain even work together now. They've mapped out a calendar of feast days that have quietly been transformed into rationing schedules. Saints' days are soup days. The Feast of St. Leonard? Turnip stew. No feast, no celebration, just a thin broth, and the quiet reassurance that yes, this is all part of a greater plan. Maybe. There's something about framing hunger as holiness that makes it easier to bear. You're not starving, you're purifying. You're not deprived. You're devout. Even the children are told that going without is an offering, a gift to God. who surely understands that there's only half a sack of oats left. You hum prayers while stirring your watery pottage, not because you're pious, but because the sound keeps your stomach from growling. Historians still argue whether this overlap between religious fasting and siege rationing was strategic or coincidental. Some claim it was pure practicality use existing traditions to ease tension and manage scarcity. Others believe the church encouraged this blend of survival and sanctity as a deliberate psychological buffer. Whatever the reason, it worked. Fasting became both a shield and a justification. You notice it in other small rituals too. Blessing the bread before it's portioned, singing psalms during grinding, lighting a single candle each night before eating, even if it wastes precious wax. These gestures, normally gentle expressions of faith, have taken on urgency. It's not just religion anymore. It's rhythm, pattern, something to anchor yourself to while the world outside your stone walls unravels. But not everyone leans into devotion. There are those who scoff, who mutter under their breath, who curse saints and chaplains alike for promising salvation, when what people really need is stew. One man yelled last week, stood up during morning prayer and shouted, "Can prayers bake bread?" No one stopped him. He just stormed off. The next day, he was found trying to catch sparrows with a bent spoon. No one talked about it. Still, faith persists. People need meaning, even if it comes in old hymns and candlelit silence. The priest, once aloof and ceremonial, now walks among the sick with a pot of broth and soft words. He blesses the dying with a few drops of wine and a whisper in Latin. You're not even sure what it means anymore, but it's a comfort. It feels like something sacred still exists. There's also the chapel bread-blessed wafers, carefully stored, meant for communion. They've become symbols now, too sacred to eat, even in desperation. One day, someone suggests baking more. They're just flour and water, aren't they? They say, but no one agrees. You'd sooner boil your family crest. Those wafers are the last untouchable thing left in the castle. As long as they remain, so does the idea that this suffering still has purpose. Some try to fast for days on end, saying it will bring deliverance faster. They sit in corners with clasped hands and sunken cheeks, barely able to move. Others give their food to children or elders, claiming their faith will sustain them instead. It's noble. It's heartbreaking. Sometimes it even works. But more often, it ends with someone collapsing on the chapel floor, lips blue, pulse fading. The chaplain says they died in grace. You believe it, because the alternative is unbearable. A fringe tale from a German siege claims that a monk once survived an entire winter on communion wine and prayer alone. He wasted away until he was barely more than robes and bones, but they say his eyes shone with peace. Whether it's true or not doesn't matter. You think about him whenever your stomach cramps from emptiness. Maybe hunger can become holiness, or maybe holiness is just hunger you've learned to sanctify. Even the meals themselves start to follow patterns borrowed from religious life. First, a small blessing, then a quiet, slow eating. No talking, no scraping bowls. You chew in time with your breath. It turns every meager dinner into a liturgy, and when the food runs out, you close your eyes and whisper thanks anyway. Not because you're full, but because you made it to another night. They're still singing, not loud or joyful, but soft and plain, threading through the corridors like a thin ribbon of light. The same old hymns, sung with cracked voices and dry mouths. They echo off stone walls and reach people lying sick in the infirmary, or curled beneath old blankets near the fire. You find yourself humming one sometimes, without even realizing. It calms you. And then there's the waiting, the part of fasting no one talks about. When the prayers are done, and the bowls are empty, and the candles burn low, you just wait. Wait for sunrise. Wait for a change. Wait for someone outside to get bored, or hungry, or afraid enough to retreat. Until then you pray, not for victory anymore, just for another dawn. Tonight, the stars are out, cold and sharp above the courtyard. You sit on a bench near the chapel wall, a thin blanket around your shoulders, and you stare upward. Somewhere beyond those stars, the siege is already over. Somewhere, someone is baking real bread, but not here, not yet. Still, you breathe. You fold your hands. You whisper thanks. Not because you feel grateful, but because it helps. You'll fast again tomorrow, not out of piety, out of necessity. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. There's a rhythm to survival in the castle, now an uneven, grim beat that keeps time with who gets to eat and who doesn't. The food's almost gone. You can feel it in the silence at mealtimes, in the lengthening shadows in the cellars, in the way people start measuring each other not by rank or skill, but by how much bread they're allowed. It's no longer about fairness. It's about hierarchy. And if you're not near the top, well, you learn to tighten your belt and smile through the hunger. The steward keeps the ledger. You've seen it, thick parchment with ink so faded you'd swear the pages themselves are starving. Every day, he records the allotments. Which household gets how much bread, how many spoonfuls of barley, how much pickled meat is left in the barrel. But the numbers don't lie, and the steward doesn't flinch. He knows the pecking order better than anyone, and he enforces it like it's divine law. At the top of the food chain sits the Lord. He eats, always. Maybe not the feasts he once enjoyed, but his table still sees meat, cheese, wine, and enough bread to dip without scraping the crust. His family too. The nobility do not starve first. They starve last, if at all. Their plates are smaller now, but they still exist. And that's the difference. Visibility. They still have plates. Next are the knights and the garrison. The fighters. They're rationed with care, given protein when possible, extra grain if needed, and a pinch of dried herbs to keep their spirits up. A hungry soldier is a weak wall. Everyone knows this. You don't win sieges with starving guards. You feed your defenders before your scribes. Then come the skilled workers, the blacksmith, the healer, the carpenter who keeps the catapults functioning. They're useful, not glamorous, but critical. They eat modestly, but consistently. If one of them gets sick or faints from hunger, things start breaking tools, morale, doors, so they get enough to keep moving. And below that, the rest. Servants, scullions, stable hands, errand boys, people like you. You get the crumbs, literally. The corners of trenches, the crusts no one else wanted, the bottom scrapings from the stew pot. Some days, you're handed a bowl of hot water flavoured with onion peel and told to be grateful. Other days, there's nothing. Just a look, a shrug, and a whispered, maybe tomorrow. At the very bottom sit the sick. They eat last, if at all. It's not cruelty, it's math. Feeding someone who can't work doesn't keep the castle running. It sounds cold, and it is. But you've seen it happen. Bowls passed over beds without stopping. Bread denied with a shake of the head. Silent goodbyes made with every spoonful saved for someone who might still swing a sword. The injustice eats at you almost as much as the hunger. You've watched the steward refuse a starving mother an extra ladle of soup, only to deliver an entire trencher to the captain's dog. Yes, the dog. It's still alive, still gets scraps, still walks with its nose high, as if it knows it's outranking half the people in this crumbling stone box. Historians still debate whether medieval sieges were this rigid in their rationing. Some say generosity was encouraged, especially from nobles toward their subjects. Others suggest survival instincts kicked in hard, and hierarchy became even sharper under pressure. Either way, records show that when food ran low, it didn't get shared equally. Power ate first. And yet, people don't riot. Not exactly. They grumble. They stare. They sit in corners and mutter into their sleeves. But open rebellion? Number? Not yet. Maybe because they're too weak. Or maybe because deep down they still believe that if the walls hold, if they just last a few more days, someone out there will come to help. And when that happens, the ledgers won't matter anymore. The bread will return. The dogs will go back to scraps. And the children will eat something other than boiled thistle. One fringe tale from a siege in the north tells of a young kitchen maid who smuggled crusts from the noble pantry to the infirmary each night. No one ever caught her. Or if they did, they let her keep doing it. By the end of the siege, she was feeding half the sick ward. Some say she saved a dozen lives. Others claim it was just guilt, disguised as kindness. But either way, people remembered her name. And in times like these, being remembered is its own kind of feast. Even the act of eating has become political. You do it quickly, quietly, away from eyes that might resent you. If you get a better portion one day, you keep it hidden. You hunch over your bowl, turn your back, and swallow fast. There's no pleasure in it anymore. Only the ticking of the clock that tells you you've earned a few more hours of strength. You start to notice little trades. A crust of bread for a strip of cloth. A piece of onion for a sharpened nail. A spoonful of stew for 5 minutes of firewood. The castle economy has shrunk into bartering and hushed deals. Nothing official, all shadowy, like everything else behind these walls. And yet, people adapt. They always do. The steward may hold the ledger, but the kitchen staff have eyes. The guards know who's been skipping meals. Occasionally, a soldier will forget his ration and hand it to someone pale and shaking. It's not much, but it's enough to keep the fire of decency alive. You lie in bed at night and listen to the castle breathe slow, shallow, and full of hunger. You think about the hierarchy, the way food trickles down like water through cracked stone. You wonder how many more days it can hold before it stops entirely, before people stop pretending. But tonight, you had a bowl of broth. There was a sliver of meat in eye, tune-identifiable, chewy, but real. It came from the steward's table. You don't know why. Maybe he was feeling generous. Maybe someone else didn't show up. Maybe it was just luck. But it gave you enough strength to lie back, to breathe without shaking, and to think maybe, just maybe, you'll make it through one more day. You've stopped counting the days. The calendar disappeared weeks ago. Maybe someone burned it for fuel. Maybe it just got buried under the weight of exhaustion. Either way, time has blurred into a single, grey stretch of waiting. Waiting for a trumpet call. Waiting for a white flag. Waiting for the sound of retreating boots, or the thunder of a rescue force arriving too late. But while you wait, the food doesn't. It vanishes, bite by bite. And so you learn to stretch every morsel into more than sustenance. You learn to weaponize it. That's what this has become now. A game of endurance. The walls are intact. The gates are shut. The enemy hasn't breached you. But that doesn't mean they aren't winning. Because you can see it in the faces of the people around you. The gaunt cheeks. The sunken eyes. The way they move slower now. Not from caution, but from weakness. The siege is no longer fought with arrows or oil. It's fought with patience and hunger. But then, a strange thing happens. A shift. The food is nearly gone, yes, but so is the panic. People stop asking what's for dinner. They know, or they don't want to know. Either way, the questions stop. The fear settles. You stop waking up with hope and start waking up with resolve. A strange calmness creeps into the halls. It's not peace, exactly. It's something harder. It's grit. There are still small victories. The garden in the courtyard, somehow, keeps producing. A final row of carrots, twisted and pale, but still alive. A sprig of mint that smells like memory. The cellar gives up one last hidden wheel of cheese, buried behind barrels like treasure. The cook finds it and shares it among the guards. You get a sliver, sharp and sour on your tongue, and for a moment, you remember what flavor felt like. You notice the enemy changing too. Their fires at night are smaller now, fewer torches along the ridge, less shouting. Are they running low, getting impatient, or just cold? You cling to the mystery like a blanket, because if they're suffering too, then you're still in this, still resisting. Historians still argue whether starvation or morale was the final blow in most sieges. Was it the empty granaries, or the empty will that cracked the walls? You're living that debate now. Your stomach gave up complaining days ago, but your mind, your stubborn, aching mind is still upright. That counts for something. Then comes the word. The enemy is pulling back. You don't believe it at first, just a whisper in the barracks. But then a scout returns, breathless and wide-eyed. They're burning their own camp. Wagons are moving. Horns have stopped. It's not a trick. It's retreat. You feel your knees buckle, not from joy, but from the sudden loss of tension. You've been clenched for so long, you've forgotten what relief feels like. And still, the gates don't open. Not yet. The Lord is cautious. A siege ending doesn't mean safety. It means scavenging patrols, poisoned fields, and traps left behind. So the castle waits one more night. You lie on your straw pallet, arms folded over your chest, and realize you're still alive, still hungry, but alive. When the gates do finally open, it's slow, creaking, reluctant. Sunlight pours in like a wave, and the first thing you notice is the air. It smells like earth, not stone, like grass, not smoke. You step outside and squint. The sky looks too bright, too blue. Your stomach growls at the sight of open fields. The villagers return soon after. Those who fled before the siege faces you recognize from markets and festivals, now older, thinner, warier. They bring stories. The enemy has moved on. chasing easier prey. And they bring food, a basket of root vegetables, a bundle of leeks, a cured ham carried between two men like a prize. You almost cry at the smell, but before the feast, there's silence, a pause, a moment to remember. The chapel fills again, this time with songs, real ones, shaky and off-key but sung with breath instead of fear. You stand beside the baker, the steward, the blacksmith's apprentice who once shared his crust with you. You all made it. Not everyone did, but you did. You sit that night with a bowl of stew in your hands. Real stew. Thick, full of chunks. It burns your tongue, and you laugh. The first laugh in weeks. Around you, others are doing the same. Eating too fast, choking, smiling through tears. The cook wipes his eyes with his sleeve and says, "Don't get used to it." Everyone laughs again. The siege didn't end with a sword fight. It ended with silence, with stubbornness, with 1,000 small decisions made in kitchens, cellars, and gardens. You didn't win with weapons. You won with rationing, grinding, pickling, and faith. With carrots pulled from frozen soil. With broth made from bones. With bread that could break teeth and still held your people together. Now you sleep, belly half full, brain buzzing with the strangeness of peace. No enemy at the gate, no line at the stew pot. Just you, a wool blanket, and the ghost of hunger fading in your bones. The siege is over. And now, you lie beneath your blanket, the stone walls around you quiet for the first time in weeks. Outside, the wind rustles the grass, no longer carrying the echo of distant drums or shouted threats. Inside, your breath is slow, your muscles heavy, your thoughts finally stilling. The fire crackles softly, casting warm light against the rough walls. The terror has passed, the hunger has eased, and the silence is no longer ominous, it's restful. You let your eyes close, and your mind drifts gently over memories of turnips and trenches, of grinding grain with aching arms, of tasting mint like it was gold. The worst has passed, and though it may take time for your strength to return, tonight there's nothing left to do but rest. You are safe, you are fed, you are free. The stars outside blink calmly in the sky, watching over you like silent sentinels. No more waiting, no more weighing crumbs or counting days. Just sleep, deep, earned, and undisturbed. Let it come. Let it carry you into dreams of sunlight, of full plates and easy mornings. You've endured the siege, you've held the walls, and now you rest. Good night.